Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature podcast. This is JM and Nate, here as always every month, this time toward, the end of October.
Yeah.
We are not recording a Halloween-themed episode like everyone else is, but we'll get there eventually, probably in the heat of the summertime when people want to not watch horror except for freaks like us. So, as mentioned, we are a science fiction literature podcast. We come to you every month and talk about stories and the history of science fiction. We have a few different platforms. We're available on anchor.fm/chrononauts. We're available on Spotify and Apple Music. And we also have YouTube. And, of course, we have our Blogspot, which features some translations as well as first digital editions of some of the works we're doing. And you can find that at chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com. We also have something new. We have a Bandcamp. Now, if you have been following us for a while, you know that in between our little talks, we all have little music cues as well. And those have been put together by Nate, and I think they're quite memorable sometimes and really add a lot to the episode. So we decided that we wanted to put them up there for people who wanted to just kind of listen to them in isolation, perhaps. So what's the Bandcamp address?
It's chrononautspodcast.bandcamp.com.
Of course, yes. So if you like the little synth cues, and sometimes not so little, as we do some readings as well with background musical accompaniment, feel free to check that out. So today, we have decided to cover actual invention, the telegraph, and also the advent of radio, and the fiction that was spawned from these inventions and discoveries. So it should be an interesting episode, a little bit different than normal, because the fiction itself is perhaps a little different than the kind of stuff we normally cover. But after doing all this month, I really do feel that we are quite justified in doing this episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that you will see. And we have a little nice, not exactly a surprise, but at the very end of the episode, we are going to cover a story of classic, astounding era science fiction from the 1930s. But I hope that everyone will listen to the entirety of the episode because we have some really interesting stuff to talk about. So with that said, Nate is going to take it away now with a little background into the telegraph.
Sure. So when we think of the telegraph, we typically think of the electric telegraph. And we're going to be spending a little bit of time here discussing the history of that, as most of our stories do revolve around the telegraph tonight, be it a wireless or wired telegraph. But the electrical telegraph was not the first type of telegraph that was used. An earlier system of a visual or semaphore telegraph, which built on top of various fire and smoke signals that had been used since prehistoric times, was developed in France in 1791 by the Chappé brothers. And this system used a series of wooden arms capable of displaying 16 different signs that were mounted on top of a tower. And these different signs could represent a different letter or perhaps even a different word or a different signal or something. And the towers were mounted 10 kilometers apart. At the height of their usage in 1844, the visual telegraph network spanned 5,000 kilometers over 533 stations. And it was able to transmit messages at a rate of 450 kilometers per hour, which means that from Paris, you could reach Calais in just 4 minutes, which is pretty incredible for the time, if you think about it. I mean, this is a purely visual, human-operated apparatus. There's nothing electric about it or automated or anything like that. And we see future extrapolation of this kind of telegraph technology in the novel we covered in episode 3, The Mummy, which has a interesting semaphore telegraph system at the very beginning, along with a bunch of other very strange futuristic devices that represent early 1800s technology. But despite the fact that this system was very efficient in certain ways for the time, it had some obvious drawbacks in that there was a total lack of security. So if anybody is in visual range of the towers, they see what signals you're broadcasting up. Likewise, it's difficult to operate in poor weather when visibility conditions are bad. And it required each station to be staffed by somebody. So somebody has to be there to receive the message and then send it on to the next station in line. While the visual telegraph system was made obsolete by the introduction of the electric telegraph, some of these systems persisted until much later, such as heliograph systems, which were mirrors using the sun's rays. And these were used to signal as late as the Boer War in South Africa, which was used by both sides of the conflict. Getting to the electric telegraph itself, some attempts were made to create an electrostatic signaling system as early as the 18th century, and in 1816, English inventor Francis Ronalds had constructed an 8-mile-long electrostatic system at his family home. There were also attempts to develop electrochemical telegraphs, notably by Francisco Salva Campillo in 1804 and Samuel Thomas von Sommering in 1809. For telegraphs using solely electric current, Georges Louis Lesage had developed a primitive electric telegraph in 1774, which looks like it had a range of only a few feet. However, very little was known about electricity in the 1700s. And in 1800, Alessandro Volta invented the voltaic pile, which was a precursor to the modern battery, in that it was able to generate an electric current to a circuit. And in 1820, Hans Christian Ørsted developed the relationship between electricity and magnetism. These discoveries, as well as other work done around this time, laid the foundation for the century of electric progress which was to follow, and allowed for the practical ability to construct something capable of signaling with an electric current. So, Paul Cannstatt, Baron von Schilling, worked as a diplomat for the Russian embassy in Munich, and he was aware of Ørsted's work, as well as the work of Sturgeon, Ampere, and Schweiger. Schilling developed a prototype electric telegraph in 1828, and by 1836, his design was able to work over a 5-kilometer line. However, he died the next year in 1837, so the proposed line was never built. Around the same time, Carl Friedrich Gauss and Wilhelm Edward Weber at the University of Göttingen developed a telegraph using an electromagnet. The first commercial use of an electric telegraph was in Britain by a system devised by William Cooke and Charles Wheatstone. Cooke and Wheatstone were aware of the work of Schilling, Gauss, and Weber, and they constructed a system which was purchased and used over a 14-mile stretch on the Great Western Railway between London and Bristol. This telegraph was based on Schilling's design. The telegraph worked by having 5 wires controlling 5 different magnetic needles. The idea was the current would move the needles back and forth, and when used in conjunction with one another, the needles would point to different letters. Signals were transmitted by a keyboard-like device. However, it's a very overly complicated piece of technology, despite the fact that it had a relatively simple user interface, and was eventually simplified, though not by its inventors, but through the people that actually used it, by the operators, to a one-needle design. So if you're ever wondering what our logo is for the podcast, it's one of these one-needle telegraph designs, although we're using the French model designed by Louis-François Clement Breguet in the 1850s, not the British Cooke and Wheatstone. But the man known most for the electric telegraph is the American Samuel Morse, who got interested in the idea of an electric telegraph in 1832. By 1837, he was demonstrating his design, which, unlike Wheatstone's design, used only one polarity, switched either on or off to signal. The design was much simpler from an engineering perspective to set up, though it required more training for its operators than the relatively simple Cooke and Wheatstone user interface. Despite this, trained operators could handle about 25 to 30 words per minute, a speed generally faster than that was capable in the Cooke and Wheatstone model. Morse filed for a patent caveat in 1837, and in 1843, Congress passed a bill constructing a line between Washington and Baltimore. The first message, the famous "What hath God wrought?" was transmitted on May 24th, 1844, and the Morse system is widely adopted, soon surpassing the Cooke and Wheatstone system for use in Europe. By 1861, the transcontinental telegraph line was finished, and in 1865, the transatlantic cable was successfully laid, connecting the Americas with Europe. Now, building on the principles of the telegraph and the work in acoustics done by Helmholtz, Alexander Graham Bell filed for his telephone patent on March 7th, 1876. The basic principle was the undulating electric current would cause an electromagnet to vibrate, causing disturbances in the air, creating sound, and vice versa, going the other way. By the time that the literature we are looking at tonight was written, the telephone had just been introduced and was slowly starting to not only compete but replace, in some cases, a system of the telegraph that had been around for decades. But as we will see, the telegraph would persist for quite a while further beyond the introduction of the telephone. Regarding the telephone itself, a number of people shortly after Bell was awarded the patent filed disputes against him, some with more legitimate claims than others, such as Elisha Gray, who filed for a telephone patent literally on the exact same day that Bell did. Other challengers had a much weaker claim, such as Antonio Meucci, who filed a caveat in 1874 that does not describe use of a diaphragm or an electromagnet, though he retroactively claimed that it did. There just wasn't any documentation from the time to support any of his claims. Nevertheless, Bell beat all of his challengers in court, and his system was widely adopted as well. So now that we have the ability to signal with electric current, as well as transmit voice over wires, by the turn of the century, people were devising ways to get rid of wires altogether, which we'll explore in a little bit. But with the introduction of the telegraph and the widespread adoption of the Morse system, as well as the widespread adoption of the telephone a couple decades later, we see a lot of reflections of the technologies in the literature of the time, not only in this niche operator telegraph culture that we're going to take a look at, but also in some very well-known authors. We see the telegraph come up in the poetry of Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson.
And Henry David Thoreau.
Yeah, right.
Yes. So, I mean, despite people like that writing about the telegraph in near magical terms, it seems like, according to one of the resources we use, Tapping the Wire by Stefan Schoberlein, that not many actually understood at first how the telegraph worked.
Right.
So Thoreau talks of listening to the wire and pressing his ear to the post and hearing harp-like sounds. And could be a metaphor, of course, but almost seems the way it's written that it's not. And another writer, Christopher Pierce Cranch, he had a story, An Evening with the Telegraph Wires, in which a protagonist sits in a tree and seems to hear vibrations from the wires. And he is related, apparently, to a mesmerist, so he wonders if he can hear the dispatches and thinks that would be really, really cool and novel thing. So he grabs the wires, and despite receiving massive electric shocks, sentences form in his brain, and the messages are magnetically conveyed to him.
Yeah, there's always been this interesting link between wired communication and later wireless communication and spiritualism and mediums, which I think is just fascinating.
It goes on.
Yeah, right. And some of the secondary sources we consulted, of which there were quite a few, and we'll post all of these in the episode description, but they get into this angle as well as the idea that the telegraph has now created a virtual space, in a sense, where we're able to communicate with somebody over a distance where they're not in the same location. And it introduces a very, what we would consider modern network, in a sense, of how information relates to one another. And it's a really interesting way of looking at it, especially how old and comparatively primitive, but how it allowed us to advance communication in a way that was near instantaneous, and what the ramifications of that meant, not only from things like a military perspective, but on a personal person-to-person communication level.
Yeah. And there's a lot of organic metaphors, because going back to the first developments of wired communications, the whole idea of electricity passing through wires was specifically linked to the animal nervous system.
Right.
So you have concepts like a web, which I naively perhaps thought not so long ago was something that was invented in the 1990s for communication purposes, actually dating back to like the 1830s. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So also we have the writer Edward Everett Hale in 1858. He wrote an essay called The Dot and Line Alphabet, and he was trying to say that it's better than the regular English alphabet and should be taught really early in school. And he talked about how telegraphy could apply to all the senses. He made some examples. He talked about a blind girl smelling a message in a chemical telegraph,
Right.
and a guy with a really long tongue climbing a pole and grabbing a wire and snipping it and applying it to his tongue and being able to taste the message of a military dispatch. So we have some really interesting physiological speculations here, almost some transhumanism happening here in a really early sense.
Yeah.
There was also somebody named Vorselman de Heer, and he proposed a finger electrophysiological system, so voltage applied to the 10 fingers to send messages. Sounds a little bit tingly.
Yeah, maybe not the most pleasant way to talk to somebody.
Yeah, maybe for some people. But you get used to it, right?
Yeah.
How kids like to apply their tongues to batteries and stuff just because it feels kind of cool.
Right.
But then the problem with that, of course, is that not everyone is equally sensitive, so you'd have to be adjusting the voltage all the time according to who was using it. And then we had things like Siemens, the German scientists, having his subjects put their hands in water to test the faults in his wires and cables. Pretty interesting stuff. William Thomson II, the more successful transatlantic developer of the cable there, was using tongues to test the faults and differences in the signals as well. The trembling tongue of steel was the first telegraph needle.
Yeah, it's quite a big phenomenon in the literature of the time, and it certainly produced some rather strange works. The first we're going to be covering tonight is an anthology, and we're going to do a couple selections from it. This book is Lightning Flashes and Electric Dashes, which was published by W.J. Johnson, and I believe he also did the editing and curation of it. There is at least 3 editions of the book. The first edition is from 1877. The third is from 1882, and the second is possibly from 1879, but I couldn't confirm that 100%, as it doesn't seem to be available online, but both the first and the third edition are on Google Books.
Most of these come from a magazine that was specifically developed for telegraphers called The Operator.
Yeah.
But not all of them, interestingly.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting how it was kind of put together. The preface of the first edition said that it aims to present articles from each of the principal telegraphic writers with a few on telegraphic subjects from well-known outsiders. And it says that it's the second book of its type, the first of which is presumably Oakum Pickings, a collection of stories, sketches, and paragraphs contributed from time to time to the Telegraphic and General Press, which was also published by W.J. Johnson in 1876. However, that one appears to be the collections of one author, a W.P. Phillips, who went by the pen name John Oakum, whereas Lightning Flashes is an anthology of a whole bunch of writers. And the first and third editions are substantially different from one another in that the story order is slightly different, as well as the story selections themselves. So, for example, the Carnival of Oshkosh which is a recreation of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar set in a telegraph office, is only in the first edition and not the third. And A Lady Telegrapher's Interesting Reminiscences of a Summer in the Country is only present in the third and not the first.
So let's talk about that aspect of it for a second.
Yeah,
There were a number of failed strikes by telegraph operators in the early 1870s,
right.
and this was mostly against the Western Union Corporation. The strikes were failures because the corporation was just too powerful and the strikers were replaced. Now, the ironically, perhaps we might consider nowadays named Brotherhood of Telegraphers was actually very sympathetic to women working in the field, and a lot of the operators were women.
Yeah.
They did demand equal pay, but it didn't really work out in their favor. A lot of the corporate establishment believed that women, in fact, wouldn't demand greater wages with seniority, but instead just sort of retire into marriage. And so, even though this is obviously a pro-telegraph anthology, it seems like many of the stories, perhaps the most interesting one anyway, that we read, or romance stories, that
Right.
do in fact end with the telegrapher sort of leaving their post in a happy way, and it's seen as a good thing. So let's talk about the three stories we decided to read, and then I do want to bring up one telegraph romance novel that we in fact didn't read because it's long.
Yeah.
But it seems like a really interesting work that I'd like to talk about for a minute. But
No,
let's
for
talk
sure.
about the stories first.
Yeah, like we mentioned, the first and the third editions are different from one another. We weren't able to find the second edition, so we're not sure if there are any stories in that one that aren't present in either the first or the third. But the three stories we read for tonight are present in both the first and the third. But we just want to mention that if you want the full Lightning Flashes experience, then you really need both. So we covered three stories tonight from the anthology. The first one is Kate, an electromechanical romance, which was written by Charles Barnard. He was quite a prolific journalist and extensive contributor of fiction to several popular magazines, and this appears to be one of the few, if not the only one, that was published outside of these niche telegraph publications, as this one appeared in the May 1875 issue of Scribner's Monthly, was later republished in Lightning Flashes, as well as later on an anthology of Bernard's short stories called Knights of Today or Love and Science, which also heavily feature other telegraph stories. So Kate starts off by engine number 59 pulling into a train track, and engine 59 is this really gorgeous engine, much admired by all the passengers, though doubtlessly none are admiring it more than the narrator of the story. A woman on the platform flirts up a handkerchief, signaling to the engineer. This is the station master's daughter, working as an operator at the telegraph office, who has begun a friendship over the telegraph with somebody 100 miles away, and she also becomes interested in John, the engineer on the number 59, who passes by every day. One day, she gets on the fireman's perch, and he tells her that there's a contest to see who can travel 5,000 miles on the railroad with the least expenditure of oil and coal. The train starts to move, and as they're going, Kate thinks of the idea of using the train whistle to sound out her name in Morse code to let her know that they're coming by. So she teaches him the Morse code, and later that night hears him sounding off her name by the train whistle. At 10 p.m., her father wants to leave, and Kate tells him that she'll just finish up in a little bit, but after everybody's gone, she makes sure that nobody's on the telegraph line so she can have them to herself, so she can talk with her telegraph friend Mary 100 miles away. The two of them discuss the telegraph whistle, and Kate thinks it's quite romantic, but possibly risky. Mary suggests that they construct a private telegraph circuit with a battery that they could communicate on. Some days later, after the word Kate is heard blowing in the whistle, some men on the platform laugh and say, "Who's Kate?" So she meets up with John and says that this whistle idea is way too risky and they might have to give it up. That Sunday, when they're spending some time together, they're walking in the woods by the railroad and they find some abandoned telegraph wires in the woods. I guess some pretty good fortune there.
Yeah.
They trace the wire to its source and deduce that it's about half a mile long. Kate says they can use it to construct a private telegraph circuit, but John says it'll be expensive. Kate doesn't care if they can see each other every day, and a few days later, she receives a bell by mail that she can hook up to the telegraph. She can make the battery herself. They discuss where the best place to set up the equipment would be. Kate brought some stirrups, and John climbs one of the telegraph poles as Kate unrolls the wire. And after a few more hours, they finish setting up the private line. The next day, she's all nervous if it's going to actually work, but sure enough, it does. She hears the bell, and a little later, the train pulls in. 2 weeks pass without incident, and the circuit's working just fine. But one day when the directors are in, her bell starts ringing like crazy. The director's train is on the track, and she realizes that the 59 is going to crash into it, and her foresight from the use of this telegraph system causes her to get a message out and avert the disaster. Everybody wants to know how she knew that this train was going to come in and crash, and she's kind of talked into a corner here about revealing the secret telegraph line. Everybody cheers and kisses, and the president removes John from the 59, promoting him to the repair shops at Slauson, and then Kate is requested to resign her place, and she does so
Yeah, she
happily.
gets fired, but it's a good thing.
Right, exactly, yeah. And that's where this one ends off. So we have a happy ending with our telegraphic lovers presumably living happily ever after.
So, do you think this is like one of the first examples of hacking in fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you see similar cases of this in other stories in Lightning Flashes, which we didn't cover because there are quite a lot. There's at least 15 to 20 stories in there. So
honestly, most of it's not very good,
no, it's they're not great stories, but some of the ideas they bring up are interesting for how early they are. I mean, Kate has an online friend, you know?
Right. And they're very resourceful in figuring out a way to communicate the messages they want to communicate by using the technology at their disposal.
Right. Yeah. And this idea of romance plays a theme in a lot of the other stories in Lightning Flashes. I would say that maybe a quarter to a third of the stories in there revolve around some kind of romantic plot where the two lovers are communicating to each other with the telegraph and they have to keep it secret somehow or something like that. And the telegraph is a perfect way to do that because it's much harder to snoop in on your conversations.
There's another one, I think I can't remember what the name of it was, something about the train again, but it was about two people that meet on a train and the girl's parents are there and they don't want the parents to overhear their conversations,
right.
So they start just tapping out Morse code on the whatever, the seat rest, and it's like, it's, again, resourcefulness.
Yeah,
being
absolutely.
able to use this new language in interesting ways.
Yeah.
This new way of communication. There were two other stories as well that we sort of read through. I think that Kate was probably the best one.
Yeah, I agree.
So from an interest perspective.
Yeah, and you can tell that there's a reason that this was published in Scribner's and none of the other ones were.
Right.
So it looks like Barnard was actually a very prolific author outside of the Telegraph stuff, but the other two stories we read for tonight were written by actual practicing Telegraph engineers. So the next one we read was $1,000 Reward, My Foot Race with a Telegram, written by Ralph Pope, who was the younger brother of electrical engineer Franklin Pope. And Franklin Pope is going to come up a bit in the next episode, but Franklin Pope was very much like a Thomas Edison figure in that he was very, very much involved in almost every single emerging electrical technology. And maybe the reason that we don't know Franklin Pope as a household name in the same way that we know Edison is that Franklin Pope accidentally electrocuted himself one night while trying to fix the power.
Oh. Yeah.
But Ralph Pope lived to an old age and served as the secretary for the American Institute of Electrical Engineers for about 25 years. And this was the major association for electrical engineers in America at the time. So he was a very big electrical engineer, telegraph engineer, and he wrote this story, which I guess is like some of the other stories in Lightning Flashes, where it's supposed to be, I guess, a interesting anecdote, a funny thing happened on the way to the office type story. So somewhere in the rural areas of New Jersey, the narrator, presumably Pope himself, so I'm just going to refer to him as Pope, and his friends stumble upon a corpse. And this corpse had been there for several days. They notify the police, who don't really seem interested in taking up the case as what they perceive to be just like a wandering tramp who got killed, which I guess is pretty funny that the police don't give a shit in the 1870s either. But the narrator says it doesn't look that way and even hints at a potential reward, which motivates the police to actually get off their ass and do their job. They all go to the corpse together and the face is decomposed beyond all recognition. It's really grisly and gory, kind of out of
Yeah.
tone for the rest of the story, and it kind of stuck out for me.
Yeah.
But on the body, there's a elaborate R on the sleeve of the jacket, as well as a Colt revolver and a clear bullet hole in the temple. And it looks like suicide, but his pockets had been rummaged through, so maybe it wasn't. In the body's coat pocket is an issue of the New York Sun, so maybe our corpse had been reading some Edward Page Mitchell in
Could
the
be.
weeks before his demise. But this particular issue of the Sun is a clipping of an article, The Missing Contractor, and it advertises a $1,000 reward for information on the whereabouts of a Henry Roberts, someone who skipped out on a job without paying his employees around Easton, Pennsylvania. The crowd deduces, well, here's the contractor. Thus, someone is eligible to claim the reward, which is payable by contacting the New York Police Department. Pope thinks the chief of police will no doubt try to claim it for himself, but he feels that he is entitled to it. So it's now 1 p.m. The Telegraph office doesn't open up until 5, so the earliest the chief could possibly get a message to New York would be about 6. The narrator can walk to Jersey City in 4 hours, and if they're quick, they can get there before the telegram does. So after some modifications to their route, including taking a horse car through Newark, they make it to Jersey City at around 5. They're just able to catch the ferry on time and get to the police station in New York. And they're told that the person offering the reward isn't there, but he's at the 9th Street precinct. So while they're waiting, a telegram comes in to the detective that they're looking for, and him not being there, the messenger boy says they'll forward it to his residence. And Pope and his friend figure they can run faster than the messenger boy, so they set at it, and they meet the detective, a Mr. Tully, in his home. They fill the detective in on the case, he congratulates them, and just a few moments later, the telegram from the chief arrives, all to the amusement of everybody there. They take the train home, and one of the passengers is inquiring if the train went to Easton. And the narrator strikes up a conversation and asks him if he knows Roberts, the contractor. And at this, the man's face totally changes. The next day, the Sun publishes an article about the mystery of the corpse. And it wasn't Roberts at all, but an A.K. Rich who was driven to suicide over some kind of financial matter. And that follow-up article is published in the Sun a few days later, saying that Roberts had returned without explanation, leaving the narrator wondering if the man on the train he encountered was in fact him. So yeah, this was pretty short, not really that great.
And it didn't really have anything to do with the Telegraph, which...
Yeah,
not,
I mean...
Not really, anyway.
Yeah, I guess the thing with the Telegraph that it involved was the fact that now communication goes the speed of electricity.
Yeah.
And they're not racing a horse or anything like that. They're racing the operating hours of an office that can send out an electrical signal. And you know, he could have made this a lot better, I think. I mean, he clearly was not a literary guy, and I don't know if he wrote any other fiction or anything like that, but it wasn't a very well-written story. And for the type of plot, I think he could have made this a lot more entertaining. He just tells it in a really dry, matter-of-fact kind of way that it doesn't really have any momentum or thrill behind it, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, these are stories published in a magazine for telegraph operators. They're definitely not something that probably even the people that wrote them imagined would be remembered almost 200 years into the future.
Right.
And put on a podcast.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next one.
Sure. Yeah, the third one is Into the Jaws of Death by a Henry van Hoevenbergh, another practicing telegraph engineer. Although not as prolific as Ralph Pope, he still held more than 20 patents in the Elizabeth, New Jersey branch of the Baltimore and Ohio Telegraph Company. So this one revolves around a Earhart who is, by his own admission, not a great storyteller. He's only had one remarkable experience, which he's going to relate to the narrator, as he never did in full before. And this relates to his adventure with some highwaymen. And since the train was over 4 hours late he was waiting for, they have some time, so he might as well tell it to kill some time. So in 1867, Earhart was operating a telegraph in the city of H somewhere. It's not as obvious what the city was as it was with the last story, which I guess I didn't mention, but for whatever reason, Pope blanks out the city of Elizabeth in New Jersey, even though it's clearly like that's where it is. I don't know why. But anyway, Earhart is a skilled and quick telegrapher. and he's struck up a friendship with the station agent, a Mason, and he's taught him a great deal about telegraphy. He introduces him to an Annie L., who runs a small office about 50 miles away, and the two are conversing with each other quite a bit, and Earhart wants to do something about it. And he starts to practice with a foot pedal to imitate Annie's style, and begins covertly talking to Mason, pretending that he's her. So in addition to dropping the novel The Moonstone, which sounds quite interesting.
I want to read that.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot about that besides this story doesn't really say much about it. And I've heard so much about this book. It's something of an epic of Victorian adventure fiction, and I really want to read it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It sounds super
I don't
cool.
think we'll do it for the podcast. It's probably just a personal reading project, but yeah, it sounds awesome.
Yeah, so this weird name drop comes in out of the middle of nowhere, but he also describes what Mason is wearing in detail and what he's doing at the moment, which so startles Mason that he just gets up and runs out of the office. Earhart is chastised by somebody from R, the largest city on the line, who tells him to stop screwing around on the line and gives him a message to relay to the bank. So he sends out his porter to deliver it, who comes back with a response, which Earhart is about to transmit back when all of a sudden somebody grabs him and puts a gun to his head.
And then we all heard the Raven riff for Into the Jaws of Death going through our heads.
Yeah, right.
Also, the riff for Doomsayer by Rampage, right?
Yo, yeah.
Hey, Vic.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually just listening to that one not too long ago.
Yeah, I haven't listened to that in a while, but Raven gets regular plays, including the Architect of Fear album, so yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, this message Earhart was about to send is related to the train movements. And there's something on that train that these people would very much like to steal. So they instruct him, under the threat of death, to send another message requesting the train in question urgently come out. So basically they can hijack the train and rob it. Smith, the man with them who knows some telegraph stuff, tells Earhart to send it slowly so he can verify he's indeed sending the correct message and not sending out a warning. And a message comes back asking why he sent something so slowly.
Yeah, and this was really funny to me. Sorry for interrupting.
No.
This totally reminded me of like some like newbie on the internet sort of getting on like some thing and being like, bro, I got mad skills. And and the other guy's like, oh, you're an idiot. Hey, why are you so slow?
Yeah, right.
It was so some real. I definitely had 90s internet flashbacks in particular reading that.
The parallels are really astounding, I think, in a lot of ways. And
there's some more good hacking in this one too, of course. And the whole like guy sitting in the same room pretending to be the love interest of the other dude, like that's so shitty computer science class based.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's really interesting how early some of these concepts date back.
Yeah.
But when they get the message that the bank is asking him why he's sending so slowly, Smith tells him to just lie and say that he has a sore finger, so he can't really telegraph fast. But
I spelled Mountain Dew in my keyboard, actually.
Yeah. Got a little too crazy there. But after the message is sent out, he remembers that he installed this foot pedal telegraph. And he's able to get a message out that the train mustn't be sent off, and he's actually being held up by armed highwaymen.
Yeah, and he's sending really fast.
Yeah.
Now, but because he's using the foot telegraph, the guy that says he's a telegraph operator, but if he is one, he's a really shitty one, because he needs things to be, like, super slow.
Right.
He doesn't realize it's coming from the same office.
Yeah, and presumably it's, like, under the table or something, where the highwaymen can't see what he's doing.
You presume that they might hear it, like, they might hear the actual clicking sounds produced by the key, but I don't know.
Yeah, I guess if it's close enough to a railway and there's like freight trains going back and forth, there might be some opportunities to get
and these guys don't seem very sharp anyway.
No,
so,
But Earhart feels like he's going to be shot no matter what. So he tells the people at this city of R to come with the police. And he receives word back that they're going to be there in like 40 to 45 minutes. And the police get there. And the leader goes to shoot Earhart in the head, but when he pulls the trigger, the gun misfires. So he instead just smashes him in the head with the butt of his pistol. Earhart goes unconscious and then wakes up later in the house of the president of the bank. The robbers, thanks to his bravery, were all captured, tried, and sentenced to prison. And he marries the daughter of the bank who nursed him back to health.
Yeah, so here we have an interesting reversal where the guy actually gets to leave his job and marry the president's wife. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. But yeah, a bit of intrigue in this one, and I would say that's another theme that comes up in these Lightning Flashes stories of using the telegraph to either solve crime or do something with criminals that are wanting to steal something. There's a couple stories in there related to that. Yeah, pretty interesting stuff, if not the most necessarily best written stuff in the world.
No. Now this one was much better though, I thought. I
Oh,
mean
absolutely.
it was
Yeah.
quite funny and intriguing, and it definitely, even though it wasn't good, those reminiscences to more modern things that we kind of associate with the modern hacking culture and computer culture and stuff growing up around the early internet days was quite striking.
Yeah. And we're going to see issues of security and I guess a precursor to what we might consider online privacy in a later story. But yeah, it's pretty much fascinating how the signals that are transmitted are essentially digital signals and are
Right.
very similar to how, though on a much more primitive scale, packets are transmitted over the internet, and how, again, in a much more primitive sense, but a network and a type of virtual culture emerges from this system, because it looks like from all of these stories you there's have people hanging out on the telegraph lines, talking to one another when they get bored at work or something like
Yep.
that. It's not all official communications of this train is coming back at this time or something like that.
And only the operators of the network are privileged enough to
Right.
really, really understand this communication, be able to do it privately, and transmit the communications of the users.
Yeah.
By the way, telegraphy is very expensive at this time.
Oh, yeah.
So everyone who is using the telegraph would have been somebody of upper class and
Typically,
social standing.
Yeah.
In the 1850s, in the United States, a telegraph will cost approximately $1.50. In the 1850s, that is a lot of money.
That's a lot of money for
That's a lot of money.
$1850, yeah.
By the 1870s, it had gone down to $1.40.
Yep.
So now I think they did do it by words, so that's probably just sort of an average
Right. Yeah.
length.
Yeah.
Because counting the words was very important
Yep.
in the profession. So
Yeah. But no, it definitely had major usages in wartime. The American Civil War, in particularly, used the telegraph extensively. And we also have issues of espionage, cutting the wires and things like that and trying to intercept communications. And again, very hacking type of an ethos. And in the Kate story, they build this whole system themselves out of parts they got together, or parts they found in the woods. She had to special order a bell, but for the most part, they built this system themselves, and they kind of piggybacked it on existing infrastructure. And yeah, I mean, if that's not hacking, then I don't know what is.
yes, and before we get up to our next work, I'd like to cheat a little bit and talk about a story that we didn't read.
Okay.
We didn't read this. It's quite long. Can't remember the word count, but it would be probably over 250 pages. And it is a melodramatic romance written in 1880. And so the idea of reading it didn't exactly captivate me. However, reading about this book in the secondary sources, there are a lot of interesting things brought up in this book, and I almost feel like it might have been a good thing to read.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to cheat a little bit and talk about it. This book is called Wired Love, A Romance of Dots and Dashes by Mary Cheever Thayer, published in 1880. And this is an early example of, I guess you could say, mediated love, and where two telegraph operators fall in love and communicate via Morse. And in the beginning, they're referred to as C and N. And they are doing exactly what you mentioned earlier about basically it's downtime at the office.
Right.
They're bored, so they're wiring to each other. Neither of them knows what the other looks like, but gradually it seems like their talk gets more intimate. Probably not too steamy. I mean, it's 1880, and I think everyone knew that it's kind of public, people could listen in.
Right.
Even in, like, the example of the Jaws of Death story, I think at one point, like, somebody breaks in because it's the Annie nonsense, and like somebody's obviously listening on the wire and taps out, "Stop this nonsense now!" Right? Like it's just like you're really annoying.
Yeah.
So
you never know. Maybe late at night they're going to be transmitting passages from the Power of Mesmerism to one another.
Oh yes, that's true. That's true. So yeah, so they're chatting back and forth, and obviously they feel reasonably secure that nobody's listening and nothing compromising is being said. But there are a few interesting quotes because there is a lot gone into in this book about how N, whose real name is Natty, her job is quite lonely and there's not really a lot to do. And we'll be getting to a work that covers that in, I think, a darker light shortly. But there's a hint of that here for sure in this earlier work. And I'm just going to read what she says here on the wire to C, whose name is Clem, I think. So she says to him, "I was thinking only last night how unbearable would have been the solitude of my office had I not been blessed with your company. I was lonesome enough before I knew you. But now, I never am." So, also at one point she says, "There certainly is something romantic in talking to a mysterious person, unseen and miles away." She has a friend named Miss Archer, who's an opera singer, and she's kind of her more worldly friend who gets around a bit and knows a bit about the world. And Miss Archer herself does some interesting speculations about electricity and communications. For instance, she says, "We will soon be able to do everything by electricity. Who knows, but some genius will invent something for the especial use of lovers. Something, for instance, to carry in their pockets, so that when they are far away from each other and pine for a sound of that beloved voice, they will have only to take up this electrical apparatus, put it to their ears, and be happy. Ah, blissful lovers of the future." Wow, 1880, man. Like,
Yeah.
It's kind of great, actually, to see that. So, yeah, I mean, the book goes on, and they talk a lot, and Natty says other things to her love interest, like, "I am sure I am perfectly willing you should imagine me as beautiful as you please." So, we're not yet in the era of send pics PLS.
Right. Yeah.
But the Telegraph romance in this book at first serves to alleviate solitude and boredom. She does bring up something interesting later on, where it turns out that after a while, it's actually worse when they're not connected. So she craves this connection so much that what was once pleasurable and alleviating, now when it's absent, that is, when it's not quiet at night and she can't work the wire and talk to him, it's actually more upsetting than it was before.
Yeah.
So in the end, they have to meet in person. And of course, because this is a romance novel from 1880, they do. And they end up moving in the same boarding house somehow. But their landlady's really nosy, so they figure out a way to send coded messages to each other between rooms even. And there's all kinds of misadventures and misapprehensions, but in the end, their love proves true. But there's a return to Morse in the final page, and it has to be decoded at the end of the book. And even when they're in the same room, their most intimate communications are, in fact, through Morse, drumming with pencils and scissors and fingers. There's a bit of, even in early on, when they just start talking, there's some gender confusion, and Natty's not sure whether Clem is a man or a woman. And C says that N can imagine him as a woman if she wants. So it's an interesting thing. We didn't read it. I just wanted to talk about it because it just seems so interesting.
Yeah,
now
absolutely.
I'm thinking, could it possibly be worse than Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli?
Who knows?
I don't know. Maybe not. And it probably doesn't have Marie Corelli's high-class snobbery either.
No.
So there you go. And, it is a romance novel, so the two lovers do get to connect. I don't quite know if one of them loses their job or not. I don't think so, but I guess you'd have to read the book to find out.
Yeah.
But that is, I think, an interesting precursor to the work we're about to talk about by a much, much more famous author.
The next author we're going to be covering tonight is a very well-known author that is typically not known for his association to science fiction. So the only time that we cover him on the podcast is this story, as it is very much related to the Telegraph. Henry James was born on April 15th, 1843, to a theologian also named Henry James, and he was the younger brother of William James the philosopher, and his younger sister was the diarist Alice James. So really quite the literary family here. He's considered to be one of the greatest authors in the English language by some, and is not only very well read still, but also very well studied and incredibly prolific. So we're not going to be really going to too much of his life here, as no doubt that can be found in much, much, much greater detail elsewhere, especially as this is really the only time we're going to be coming to his work on the podcast. Now, if we were a horror podcast, we would absolutely cover Turn of the Screw and some of his other ghost stories.
Yeah, and I was just going to point out that even though he's not known for science fiction, he is known more for a somewhat genre-adjacent work, The Turn of the Screw, which is very popular even to this day, and probably not truly representative of him.
No, I wouldn't say so. But it does have a lot of his stylistic touches.
Yeah. Oh, and we'll get into the style later.
Yes, we certainly will. Turn of the Screw was recently adapted in TV form by, I think it's Netflix, the second season of Haunting of Hill House. They did the Bly Manor or whatever. It was also adapted in the 70s by Dan Curtis, who was the showrunner of Dark Shadows, who also adapted it in Dark Shadows form for one of the arcs. So it's really gotten quite a life.
It has several more modern movie interpretations as well. And I think it was the inspiration for the Innocents as well.
Yeah. But James is also known for some of his other novels, Portrait of a Lady from 1881, The Bostonians from 1886, which I really did not care for at all, and The Ambassadors from 1903. But he had over 20 novels published in his lifetime and a couple afterwards, as well as more than 100 short stories and novellas. So really an enormous body of stuff. Now, when James wrote this, which was in the 1890s, telegraphers were working low pay and long hours. And in the UK, a certain Lord Tweedlemouth, which if I didn't know better, I think it was a fake name. It just sounds so ridiculous. But he led a committee to look into the grievances of the telegraphers and decided that they're just all being a bunch of whiners and complainers.
Yeah. Sounds like a real asshole.
Yeah, right. And actually lowered the telegraphers' pay. So in response, there were threats of worker strikes all over Britain. In the Cage was written on top of these conditions, as well as issues of privacy, which had also come up in the papers of the day and was a major concern for some. And James would certainly touch upon this thematically in the book. So In the Cage was published in 1898 as a standalone novella. It's about 35,000 words. I don't know, editions are like 150 pages or so. The narrative centers around a telegraph operator, a woman who is never given a name, but she works at Cocker's. And she's quite excited by the idea that through her regular duties of counting the words of telegrams, she's able to read people's messages and thus know things about them. Her work environment is a cage, literally compared to that of a confining bird cage, and this gives her an opportunity to get a glimpse of society outside of the cage, both in the physical sense and the metaphorical sense of her being caged by her lower class background. The telegrapher is, however, quite skilled at her job, and she has a very sharp memory, easily recognizing people's handwriting styles and all the other quirks that go with this kind of messaging position. She's engaged to a Mr. Mudge, a nearby grocer, who seems quite dull, really. Perhaps if, like, Square from Flatland, became three-dimensional, like he always wanted to kind of remind me of what Mr. Mudge might be like. But
he's not really an excellent cube.
No. But he does want her to transfer to a different office in a different district, not one as fancy or as extravagant, but one cheaper and more practical. The telegrapher makes a friend in a Mrs. Jordan, who's an older lady, the widow of a bishop, who manages people's flowers, but Moore uses it as an opportunity to observe their lives and the drama of the people in high society.
She's a gossip.
Yeah. Yeah, she's in an attempt to leverage the position there for herself. The classic social climber, just really wants to get ahead and sneaks in any way she can. So Jordan, like her telegraphic counterpart, loves living vicariously through other people's lives. One day, a very memorable looking lady comes into the telegraph office, and she gives the telegrapher 3 messages to process. And the telegrapher is just totally awestruck by how this lady looks. And the telegrapher reads through her messages, taking a certain interest in the names of who they are. In particular, Sissy, Mary, and Everard. And she's not exactly sure who the lady is. Maybe she's Sissy, maybe she's Mary, but she likes putting together the mysteries nonetheless. These particular letters, she finds herself just losing herself in the fantasy world of the rich and all their lavish parties, and can sense some sort of lurid correspondence here between Everhard and this woman, whatever her name is, likely using a false name. 10 days later, she sees her again, but this time she's with Everard, and their presence sticks with her for the remainder of the day, and she starts obsessing over him. She learns the name of this mysterious lady he's communicating with is Lady Bradeen, and through her observations of his behaviors, who he comes in with to the shop, what he sends out, etc., she's able to paint a picture of him for herself, of this Captain Philip Everard. Reading people's messages and reflecting on her meager background, she grows to really dislike certain types of rich people, and is amazed at just how much money these people are spending on messaging with one another. There's a quote: "She had early learnt that if you became a telegraphist, you soon ceased to be astonished." And she fantasizes about what she could do with the information on some of these people that she has. And some real hints of jealousy start to come out in regards to their wealth and her standing in the world. The telegrapher and Mrs. Jordan get to talking with one another. Mrs. Jordan wants her to join her in the flower business, as she and the telegrapher are quite alike and seem to have an understanding of one another and what they're trying to do. They talk a bit about the people whose houses she looks after. Mrs. Jordan penetrates them all, except for those of the highest class, and this makes the telegrapher feel a little inferior coming from a lower class, poor background. Mrs. Jordan is still not, though, a part of their actual social circle, no matter how much he tries, but she says that any day she'll get there. The telegrapher starts wondering if she should start social climbing instead of wasting her time away at the telegraph office with Mudge, and considers Jordan's offer. Jordan starts name-dropping a Lord Rye, who she's claiming to be particularly close with, and the telegrapher says she also sees everybody at her place, and is privy to all their personal affairs, appointments, secrets, and vices. She tells Jordan that she hates these people, which surprises Jordan, as Jordan just doesn't have the same disdain for the wealthy that the telegrapher does. Jordan tells her to give up Mudge, as she's able to do a lot better for herself, and the telegrapher just runs this thought through her head for quite a while. But her and Mudge go for frequent walks on the weekend, and the telegrapher both likes him and dislikes him. Mudge, however, is really passionate about her and has a pretty keen business sense, but isn't particularly good looking and is rather awkward. The telegrapher gets to talking to him about her job and how she hates the people that come in there, and how the hate is really what draws her to them in the first place. And Mudge is just rather nonplussed about all this and tells her that that's even more reason why she should leave. Regarding Everard, the telegrapher keeps this a secret from everyone, including Mrs. Jordan. So later, Everard comes into the office, and the telegrapher and Everard start making eyes at one another and exchange small talk and maybe a little bit of flirting here. However, it torments the telegrapher that not only can't she drop any information that she knows about him, but the upper class would view her in the same way that they'd view a washerwoman or a kitchen servant, even if she got close with them. Despite this, she can't tear herself away from these people's drama, and she makes sure to clandestinely undertake her snooping away from Mr. Buckton, the counter clerk. Her affection for Everard is in part due to his quirky writing style, and she starts to daydream, including the idea of extorting them with their secrets. Even though Everard and Lady Bradeen are communicating with one another through different addresses, the telegrapher recognizes them all, and Everard seems to almost recognize the fact that she recognizes this. The telegrapher realizes they're in some sort of danger, but the entertainment and drama from all this is better than every novel in the shop.
Yeah, she reads a lot of those.
Yeah, she does. She looks for any excuse to talk to him and actually tracks down where he lives and familiarizes herself with the neighborhood, making sure to walk by his house on her way home, going far out of her way to do so. So, definitely a level 5 stalker here.
Yep.
She goes in the building where he lives, like loiters in the lobby, looks at the signs on the wall and figures out which tenant occupies which apartment. And for a second, she runs into him face to face. She runs out in embarrassment, but continues to fantasize about these chance meetings, possibly 3 o'clock in the morning somewhere. Sometime later, Lady Bradeen comes in by herself, and the narrator tries to play it cool with how much she knows about her life and not let on anything. But the address of the telegram that Bradeen wants to send out gives her an idea of where Everard is, as he hadn't been in the shop in 19 days. However, the telegram contains what appears to the telegrapher to be a mistake with the address, and the telegrapher lets it slip that she knows about their affair when she offers to correct it. And this rather shocks Bradeen, though she agrees to the correction. Summer comes, and it's a great season for everybody but the telegrapher, who resents everybody having fun on their vacations. Mudge would like to plan something for them to get away and just can't stop talking about it. And the telegrapher doesn't know why he just can't do anything on the fly, like her lover's in danger, and he has to plan everything out and just make it so drab and boring. By August, her stalking is a pretty much nightly affair, and she passes by Everard's house every night of the working week, and eventually runs into him on the street. Everard doesn't recognize her at first. The two have a rather awkward conversation, and Everard is wondering if he should invite her up, and she can see it on his face. And she's worried about what is proper, despite the fact that she's just like stalking him on the street and all this. They continue walking together down the street, and she hopes he doesn't say anything vulgar. At some point, she says she must be getting home as she hasn't eaten yet, and Everard does, in fact, invite her up to dine with him, and the telegrapher declines. They get to talking about the telegraph office, and Everard thanks her for everything she's done, and he remarks that it seems that she's taken a particular interest in him, which makes her quite flustered and bewildered, and triggers a flood of tears in her, and she says she'll never see him again, and that she's moving to a different office and she only stayed on at Cocker's for him, which makes him blush, and the telegrapher realizes he doesn't know anything, and she decides to just lay everything on him. She put off transferring because of him because she wanted to help him, and that what she thought she was doing was there was something between the two, but something that wasn't vulgar, but wholesome. The telegrapher is a real roller coaster of emotions now, and she says she'll do anything for him, and he takes her hand and asks her, indeed, to help him out with a favor. He asks her if he has spoken of him to anybody else, and she says no, and that she says that his comforts and luxuries must be managed for him somehow, and she's just the person to do it. Everard says she's very clever and is almost about to remark that she's more clever than Lady Bradeen, but stops himself, though the telegrapher picks up on what the name is on his lips. She gets offended and stands up to leave, and he asks her to stay on at Cocker's, and she says she likes all the horrors of people like him, your extravagance, your selfishness, your immorality, your crimes. He starts to get offended, but she just continues saying, I like them, as I tell you, I revel in them. She says if she stays, she hints at the fact that she doesn't see him for weeks on end sometimes, and he says that he'll come in every day, and that he can't due to his danger, whatever that is, with Lady Bradeen, but she says she'll stay on and tells him goodbye, or tries to anyway, but she won't give him up, and he takes her hand and tries to walk her home. So this makes the telegrapher really upset, and she gets up and runs away, and yeah, it's a real dramatic scene.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Mudge has been distracted with his planning, forgetting about the telegrapher's transfer altogether, and it's her day off. And she spends it idle, sitting around outside, getting bored of Mudge, and he's prone to just talking on and on and on. She, of course, encourages him to do so, as it gives her some space to muse on the intrigue that she's involved herself in. One night, he tells her that he's ready to set a date for their marriage, as business opportunities have opened up for him, and he's even picked out a home. His promotion basically locks in her future, which makes her tear up a bit, but he says that he hopes she's done with Cockers, and she says that she is, and kind of stammers through and hints at her affair with Everard, which he then relates to him. And she says she wanted to let Everard know that he's in danger of being found out with being in love with Lady Bradeen, and Mudge just seems kind of bemused and irritated at all this and that the telegrapher is being really vague. And she again says that he was in danger and that she says that she has to help him and wants Mudge to wait for her and to be patient in all this and that it really just has nothing to do with him. And Mudge is just kind of like, okay. But she doesn't see Everard again for a little while. And when he finally comes in, Mr. Buckton takes his business. And the telegrapher keeps thinking of how she can get his telegrams that she wanted to go through and again starts fantasizing after he leaves. The telegrapher fakes being sick to Buckton and says she has to go home, and as she's leaving, she sees Everard, and she realizes he'd been waiting in the shop for her much longer than he normally does. He gestures to one of the telegrams that he had passed to Buckton, and she violently snatches it out of the counter clerk's hand, which attracts the attention of Buckton, who she glares at pretty nastily. Everard comes in Morse, sometimes with the telegrams just being a pretext to see her, sometimes not, and just hangs around the shop. The telegrapher starts to feel more and more withdrawn and avoids contact with him, and stops passing by his house on the way home. Everard hints that he won't be in town for much longer, and tries to hint to her that he's free, to little success. He tries to send a message, but retracts it. The message says absolutely impossible, to give a cue to the telegrapher, I guess, that the thing with him and Bradeen is maybe not going so well, and he leaves the shop out of embarrassment. The telegrapher doesn't see him for 18 days, and the telegrapher's mind is made up that their affair is done, and that she's now ready to live with Mudge in all of his plans. Everard starts going to other telegraph offices for his business, and weeks later, he comes back in before closing, looking really, really stressed out, asking her to save him, sending a message to a Miss Dolman of Parade Lodge, to whom Lady Bradeen had wired to take a train as soon as possible. Everard's in horrible trouble for something, and the telegrapher immediately sends it off. They have a bit of a curt interaction as work takes her attention again, and suddenly he comes in the next morning, flustered that he wanted a telegram that was sent from a few weeks prior to the same address as the one he sent out the previous night. And this gives the narrator a deep thrill, but Everard says the message wasn't delivered and that someone intercepted it. He's stammering and insisting that it's really important, and the telegrapher's just stalling with him and not really wanting to do anything about it. She says she doesn't have it anymore as it was sent too long ago to be in the record still.
Yeah, she's all of a sudden very obstructive in a way that she hasn't been.
Right. Yeah. This message seems to be related to some sort of scandal, and the telegrapher is being really rude to him and just totally refusing to help him out, even though she knows exactly what she wants. She knows exactly where it is, and she's just playing dumb. And when she finally decides to help him, they realize that the message wasn't sent out and intercepted, but it was sent to the wrong number. And this relieves Everard, as it doesn't appear to have been read by a bad faith actor, so he leaves happily. So, meanwhile, the people who own all the houses that Mrs. Jordan is looking after are out of town, though she's still privy to all the good upper class gossip, Lord Rye still being the most important of them all. Mrs. Jordan meets up with a telegrapher to go to church, and again tries to get her to join her in the flower business. She gets to talking about Lord Rye and hints at some sort of important announcement. Jordan says that Rye's great friend, Mr. Drake, who is formerly his butler, though the two have decided to separate as friends. Jordan and Mr. Drake are engaged to be married, and tells her that she has been going to Lady Bradeen, which bewilders the telegrapher, and Jordan is really surprised that the telegrapher knows Bradeen. So they start talking about their clients, and Jordan tells the telegrapher that the difference between the two of them is that the telegrapher hates her clients, whereas Jordan really loves hers. And Jordan asks her if she hates Bradeen, and the telegrapher says of course not, she's too beautiful for that. Jordan has never seen Bradeen before, but has heard quite a lot about her, the telegrapher apparently having better Bradeen gossip than Jordan. But Drake is employed as a butler for Bradeen. Jordan at first describes it as being engaged, which confused his telegrapher, but Jordan eventually explains. So she gets all the good gossip from Drake, and Jordan tells the telegrapher that Lord Bradeen is dead, and that Lady Bradeen is going to be married. And the narrator says that if Bradeen is to marry anybody, it's going to be her friend Everard, which surprises Jordan that she would be friends with him. The two exchange a bit of hostilities here, briefly, and the telegrapher is now saying that she's marrying a grocer, that she'll be far below Mrs. Jordan in her social class, and the two can't see each other anymore. And Jordan says her engagement is what saved her, is what led her not to starve. The two kiss and make up rather quickly, and eventually agree to visit each other at their new houses and their new lives. So Lord Rye had arranged for Bradeen to hire Drake, and he'll be given some quite nice lodging for the two of them to stay at. The telegrapher asks how Everard will react to this new domestic arrangement, and Jordan alludes to Everard's debts and says that none of the wealth is actually his, which the telegrapher had no idea about whatsoever. Some kind of scandal broke out, although not incredibly public. Something was found out, and Lord Bradeen would have had to act if he did not die suddenly. The scandal had potential legal ramifications. An issue of some sort of incriminating piece of evidence was found, possibly the telegram alluded to before, but Lady Bradeen had saved Everard, and the telegrapher again hints that she had been aware of their telegrams to Miss Jordan, particularly that the telegram was the piece of information which Jordan did not know that it was a telegram. This scandal forced Everard into marrying Bradeen immediately, which he did not want to do previously. So after all this exchange of information, Miss Jordan and the telegrapher depart from one another. They agree to see each other soon, and the narrator leaves full of thoughts. So this also left me full of thoughts, so I decided to reread it, going along with the LibriVox recording, which is just okay. It's not bad, but it has a sort of monotone character, and it's in a southern U.S. accent that doesn't really fit with the text. Although this isn't really a particularly British novel, despite the fact that it is set in London.
No, but he is an American expatriate living in England for the most part during this time, so I don't know. Take a drink if you got one. That was a lot of talking.
Yeah, I think I will.
So, you did a fine job with that summary, I must say. But listening to this just made me reflect on how much I did not enjoy this. This whole thing made me very impatient.
Yeah. That's why I had to reread it, because when I wrote down the summary from the first time, I was just like, I don't know what to do with this. The way James writes his novels is it's very poetic and almost dreamlike in a sense, where I didn't know what details would be significant for like a plot summary. You're just kind of taking in so much information at once, and a lot of it is very vague and through allusions and I guess indirect references.
Well, that's indirect is what it is. I mean, I don't know. I've definitely been known to enjoy many things that I would consider to be dreamlike and atmospheric.
Right, I agree.
But this was just a lot of people not saying things, people just walking into a room and looking at each other for a chapter, and a lot of fantasizing. And especially that ending. Oh my god, it just went on and on and on. This story had a lot of interesting things about it, but I feel like if this was like a 20-page story where two friends are sitting together at a bar or something, and one guy's like, well, you know, one time there was this telegraph operator, and just told this really basic, simple story, said what needed to be said. I mean, considering that this is a story from 1898, you know, it's not going to be too explicit, but just said what needed to be said.
Right.
And got it out of the way and done with.
Yeah.
That would have been fine.
Yeah.
And I can't believe I'm saying this, because I'm not the kind of person who's like, oh, get on with it. Why does everything have to be so padded out? Like, that's not normally the way I am with a lot of things, but this was just almost unbearable to me.
Yeah. I mean, I have a hard time with James's style. And a lot of people really like Henry James, and I'm just not one of them. So if you're not a James fan, this is a Henry James novel through and through. But there are some things that I really did like about this. And while I don't really care for Henry James's style, there are other people's style that do go on and on, like a Proust that like I really do enjoy. But I think somebody like an Edith Wharton could have written this like a lot better. James, I don't know, his style always feels like overwrought is the one word that comes to mind. Like I thought that if I maybe, listen to the LibriVox recording, now that I know where the plot goes, I just might be able to take in some of the language better and just kind of appreciate the poetic nature of it. But I don't know. Some of the way he constructs his sentences just feel like really stilted. It just doesn't flow maybe as well as it could. There are passages that just seem like overly dramatic for their own sake. I don't know. James just never really worked with me. Like Turn of the Screw, I just thought was okay for that reason, even
Yeah.
though I liked some of the
There's
themes
a lot
in
of
there.
indirectness in that too, and
Yeah.
I think it works all right in that story. I'm not sure what the length comparison is with the two. I think they might be close to the same.
Yeah.
They're both kind of like longish novellas or short novels.
Yeah.
This one, as with Turn of the Screw, but especially in this one, there's just a lot of people walking around important things. There's more significance in the things that they don't say than in the things that they do say.
Right.
That could be interesting up to a point, but when it's through the entire book, it's just too much. It's too much for me, anyway, personally. I have to wonder about Henry James himself and how he viewed human relationships, in the sense that I think that perhaps he had to be that circumspect about a lot of his own relationships, being a gay man raised by a religious family in the 1800s. I think that could be a thing. And I do admire, I do think that the way that sentences flow and stuff actually works. This was not necessarily an unpleasant novel to read in a literal way, but it was an unpleasant novel to read in the sense that nobody really got on with anything. Also, she, that is our sort of point of view character, is not very pleasant.
Oh no, she's a shitty person.
And I feel like he's actually a little bit mean to her as well.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's strange.
Yeah, I like the telegrapher, but I don't think you're supposed to. She's really mean-spirited. She's a creep. She's obsessive. And her behavior, I think, is what really introduces the most interesting themes of the novel and the issues that James touches on. Not just living vicariously through other people's lives, but this parasocial relationship that develops between the telegrapher and Everard and Bradeen, where she knows everything, or at least she thinks she knows everything about their lives. It turns out she doesn't really know anything at all. The fact that Everard is just like this broke playboy at the end totally surprises her. But she thinks she knows all of their details, and she fantasizes it, and she imports her own view on their relationship onto what she actually thinks is going on, even though it couldn't be further from the truth. And I think that's a really interesting thing to come up, especially for how early it is.
Yeah. I think it's kind of the opposite of what most people would speculate now, though. Most people would speculate that people are worse than they are.
Yeah.
Speculate about their horrible habits and then maybe be disappointed to find out that, oh no, they're not really as much of a playboy as they pretend to be,
Right.
Seems like we're in a different time now in that sense, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
We have a different attitude about scandal, perhaps, the popularity of reality TV and stuff like that, and all that basically based on people who might have it a bit worse off than you in certain aspects of their lives, right? And some terrible scandals that you just love to feed on.
Right. Yeah. And I think the scandal's never really gone into as far as what it is, but my suspicion is that Everard got Bradeen pregnant, and his intentions were to just sleep with her once and be done with her, but now that she's pregnant, you can't do that. And once he sees the telegrapher show some sort of interest in him, even though the telegrapher is trying to tell herself that she doesn't want it to be a vulgar relationship, I think all Everard wants to do is to sleep with her. And he makes this really obvious to her in a way that just kind of skeeves her out, even though she's the one that's stalking him down in the first place.
Yeah.
It's real kind of nasty set of characters.
It's really weird.
Yeah.
So, I guess the one thing that I did appreciate about this book is just how awkward and weird it was. And in a way, the character's complete inability to speak the truth or to really be open about anything was a part of that. It was a part of that disconcerting quality that I didn't like, but I guess I sort of admire now that I think about it in that sense. It's not a very comfortable read.
No.
And it's sort of frustrating on so many levels.
Yeah. Bit anticlimactic, too. Like, I mean, we could have at least got a suicide or somebody being run over by a train or something like that.
Yeah. But then, if we got that, it would probably be described secondhand.
Yeah, right.
Letter and not very well.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. The other interesting thing it brings up is this issue of privacy and people snooping in and listening on other people's messages.
Right.
And this was a major concern at the time because it just requires somebody to actually like look at the message you're trying to say, and they can store all the information away in their head, which is what our telegrapher does here.
Yeah.
But the issues of privacy, again, still very much persist to this day on, well, what are these telecommunication companies actually going to be doing with our data? Are they going to be managing it in a responsible, ethical fashion, or are they going to potentially stalk people they find fancy in and maybe try to extort them from their secrets or something like that? I think these are very much still relevant in today's world.
And it is really interesting because now it's the size of the thing that's kind of led to these attitudes about, for one thing, there's social media and all its privacy-related issues, but we now consider that it's so big that no one person could possibly be looking at and or interested in our data.
Right.
But for someone like me, who uses social media pretty much as a text-only platform, it doesn't really seem that different than the way it did 30 years ago. And when you think at that time, most of your traffic that you sent on the burgeoning various nets that became the internet and so on were fielded in some way by people's private computer systems.
Yeah.
And theoretically, someone you know could have been reading your messages, especially if you were on some, local bulletin board or something like that.
Yeah.
That's always been a thing, like right on into the early party lines, where you had the neighborhood all connected by a single telephone switch. And you would hear different ring sequences for different lines on the network. But theoretically, anybody could pick up their node and listen in to what was happening. I guess in various times, it's passed between something that's very elitist almost in terms of, well, only the telegraph operators are in on this, to something that's sort of democratic, as in, like, anybody can listen into this.
Sure. Yeah.
I guess it depends, on how much skill is involved in understanding the basic communications of the network.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how the technology evolved, as we were talking earlier. So the Cook and Wheatstone was complicated to set up, but it was easy to use. It was just a needle that points to a letter.
Yeah, and I was thinking that. I was thinking it would be pretty easy to use that. And
yeah. Whereas the Morse system, it's very easy to set up, but you need a trained operator who could interpret these codes that would be just totally indecipherable.
It's like trying to understand binary or something.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting how the technology developed away from user interface and more towards a simplicity of the engineering solution, whereas I think today is going in the opposite direction. They're trying to engineer more for a user interface, but the engineering back end becomes more and more and more complex sometimes.
But the core of the system is still that basic engineer-driven system that's operating underneath everything.
Yeah.
It's just most people don't get to see that.
Right.
Except when you go to a website or something and there's a weird error and you're like, whoa, what? Yeah. But yeah, some interesting concerns raised here for certain. Like I said, I can't recommend it. But
yeah, I mean, I don't know. A lot of people like Henry James. I'm not one of them. If you're a Henry James fan, by all means, check this out. It raises some really cool themes, and it's a really darker look at society. But if you're like us and you're not really that big of a Henry James fan, I think this one might frustrate you a little bit.
I only read The Turn of the Screw before, so I can't really say I'm fully qualified to talk about Henry James, but I won't be in a rush to read more.
Yeah, like I said, I did not like the Bostonians, and there's another story in The Dark Descent that I've yet to finish. I'll probably get started from the beginning.
It's not too bad, though. I mean, when it's a short story, it's easier. Like I was just saying, I feel like this could have been a 20-page story where you have two guys sitting around talking, relating, and one guy knows a thing, and he wants to tell the other guy, hey, be careful of this, because one time I heard about this thing that happened, and he just told this anecdote, and the guy was like, wow, that's really something.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go send off a telegram, and that's that.
Yeah.
And I feel like that would have been a fun... I'm not Henry James. I'm not a world-renowned author. I'm just saying I feel like that would have been a more fun way to tell this story.
Right.
And that would have saved a lot. Because the thing is, like, I was writing down a summary for this as well, because I didn't really know when we started who would be doing what. So I try at least most of the time. I occasionally reread things too. Like when we did the math episode last time, I did read Flatland a second time because I just read through it the first time. Like, I just want to get through it right now. That's kind of the mood that I'm in. And I didn't mind rereading it. It was fine. This one, I commend your fortitude in doing that. I didn't want to, no.
Yeah, I don't know. I wanted to give Henry James a fair shake because, like I said, it does raise some things, and I did really like certain aspects of the story. It's just his style isn't for me. And maybe one cynical thing he possibly did with making the style so vague in the way that he describes all the events here is that one thing the telegrapher does is she projects her own opinions and fantasies onto the events of a couple she's stalking out. Yeah. But in being vague, perhaps James is inviting you, the reader, to project your own views of your local telegraph operator onto the woman in the story.
Yes, and that's certainly a fair consideration.
Yeah.
I mean, I do often think, like I've said before, for one thing, about short stories or about stories where especially like the characters are almost like tabula rasa, where they're not very developed. But like somebody like H.P. Lovecraft, for instance, people would consider that a fault a lot of the time, and I would say, well, no, just like project your own onto it. Like he's sort of inviting you to do that, right? Like I'm not saying that James and Lovecraft are similar, really, but I'm just saying, like, it's a thing that you can do, and it's a neat trick, and you don't have to. Like I said, the telegrapher here is not a very pleasant person.
No, no.
I'm not saying that makes her a poorly drawn character, but this idea of projection and this idea of being like, well, I'm not really going to be direct about anything. I have to be circumspect. That's just the way it is for me as a writer. By the way, Henry James had written to one of his fans at one point, and I don't know if this is something he would suggest for all his readers, but apparently his indirectness was a qualm that some readers had, even in the 1890s, and this person had commented on it a little bit, even though she said she quite enjoyed his work. And he told her in his letter, among a lot of other wandering effusives, he told her that he thought the way that she should appreciate his work is in very, very small chunks of 5 pages at a time.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. I guess maybe he feels like it should be in real time. So say like all those chapters that we were reading when like he would come into the office, or both of them would come into the office, and they would just sort of putter around for a bit. And I like my summaries for those chapters were really short. I'm just like, yeah, he came in and then they exchanged some looks and she fantasized a bunch and then he left again. It's kind of like, maybe all those, you should read those like 10 days apart. Just like they experienced them. And that's, maybe then you would appreciate it more. I don't know. It's just a thought. Obviously, we didn't have time for that.
No.
We neglected to mention that this was sort of a last-minute addition to this episode.
Yeah, right. So we were going to read, what was it? Wireless Confusion.
Which is a much, much shorter story than this, but Algernon Blackwood, yes.
Yeah, right. That's what it was, right. But yeah, it didn't fit with the theme, so we're going to cover it later on when we do more like telepathy, ESP type stuff.
We might. I mean, he's got other stories that I think are perhaps better illustrations of that.
Yeah.
Because I've read a fair bit of his stuff.
Yeah.
I did find that it was sort of an interesting story, but it didn't have anything to do with the wireless. So, But we added this, and it was a last-minute thing, and we didn't have several months in which to appreciate it the way Henry James might have wanted us to.
Right.
So, sorry, Henry. But that's, we're doing a podcast, we have a deadline.
Yep. That's just how it goes.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to move on from Mr. James and head down from England to Spain.
Click, 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 and the clattering tongue of brass seems alive as I listen and hear the signals pass. Many a wonderful message goes flashing along the wire, with words of joyful greeting or tale of calamity dire. Travels the spark electric over mountain and valley and hill, under the deep blue river, over the rippling rill. Hark to the message flashing through the crystal air of morn. And to us, a song is given, An immortal soul is born. Click, 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 and the mystical wires again are telling another story to the children of men. Mouseatop, greeting, he says, may your happiness lasting be, your wedded life be joyful, your path from care be free. And yet another message is mournfully flashing by, as only the lightning travels, for evil tidings fly. Imagine the heart's emotion, as the sorrowful missive is read. A soul has returned to its maker. Your darling lover is dead.
So Henry James might have been a last-minute addition for this episode, and while this story wasn't a last-minute addition, it was maybe a last-hour addition or so. During the time period we were doing the reading for the mathematics episode, I was working on the upcoming translation of Nervo's short novella, long short story, one of those on the borderline with the word count things, but The Soul Giver, which we'll be posting on the blog spot in the upcoming months when we hammer out the final version. But the Spanish text made a note that one of the references was to a short story by Clarín. And I was like, oh, I know that guy. I'll check out this story and see what the deal with this one is. And the plot summary online sounded perfect for this episode. So I said, we got to do this one because it sounds not only like a good story, but also it covers a very, very specific point that I wanted to bring onto the podcast, but I wasn't entirely sure of how to do it. So I didn't know if we wanted to read Dickens' Hard Times, because while it's a short Dickens novel, it is a long novel for the podcast, and it's only really tangentially related to these kind of themes of industrialization, in the sense that you kind of get the point that it's trying to make. It does it really well, but it almost seems like tangential for the podcast. A book like Middlemarch, even more so, which is like 900 pages long. But I'm really glad we could cover this one because it condenses that point down into like 2,000 words. And I think it does it pretty well. So Clarín we last covered in episode 15. And we're not going to do too much of his bio here, but I just want to briefly say that Clarín was the pen name of a Leopoldo Enrique García Alas y Ordueña, and he wrote under the pen name of Clarín, which means bugle in Spanish. After the Bourbon monarchy restoration in 1874, the philosophical movement of Karl Christian Friedrich Krauss experienced a great deal of popularity in Restoration Spain and influenced Clarín. So the work that we covered last time by his in episode 15, Future Story, is one of his, I think, lesser-known works, even in the Spanish-speaking world. He doesn't seem to have much of a following in English for whatever reason. The most well-known work, perhaps, is The Regent's Wife in 1884, but Goodbye Lamb, this story we read for tonight, appears to be the other one, which is really well-known in Spain. I believe it is a part of the high school curriculum, or at least a regular part of the Spanish high school curriculum. And there's also a 1969 film adaptation of the story. The short story was initially published in a short story compilation entitled The Lord and the Rest from 1893. And this particular translation comes to us by an Owen Lindsay Boyd, which appears to be another one of these fan translations on a blog spot that's freely available online. So that's cool. And I think he did a really good translation of this story. Certainly it read a lot better to me than Future Story. I don't know if that's because this is a better story than Future Story, of which I definitely think it is. I thought this one was quite an excellent and powerful piece of writing. So getting into the story, our story circles around twins, Rosa and Panine. And together with Lamb, they live in Somonte Meadow, which has a telegraph pole that's newly appeared in it, representing to Rosa and Pinine the large outside world. Pinine finds it mysterious and climbs it a few times. Rosa listens, sometimes for hours on end, to the strange sounds that it makes in the wind.
Listening to the harp sounds.
Yeah, exactly, right. The weird sounds that the metal clacking makes when the wires go in the air, the odd sounds that reverberate through the pole itself, and she just has a curious desire to know about the communication going on with the outside world. Lamb, however, is a cow, and doesn't care one way or the other for it. Lamb has led a peaceful life, only being disturbed by the inauguration of the local railway, where one of the trains just scared her into jumping into an adjacent field. But as the trains became more frequent, she cared less and less, and they eventually fade into the background noise. The three of them had love together, and even in the toughest of times, of which there are many. Anton, their father, realizes that Lamb is their only livelihood, and he meant to save up for a second cow, so presumably they could have more cows in the future. But his wife Chinta dies within a few years of them getting Lamb, and Chinta tells Anton that the cow is their bread and butter. One day Anton goes to sell Lamb, and he comes back with her, empty-handed, as no one would pay the price that he wanted her, perhaps asking too much for the cow on purpose because he didn't want to get rid of her. But things are looking desperate, and he's forced to sell her for a lower price than normal. And Rosa and Pinine are just totally grief-stricken. The text says, quote, "They gaze with rancor at the passing trains, the wires of the telegraph pole. It was that unknown world so far from them on both sides that would take Lamb away from them. Lamb is being sold to the slaughterhouse, beef for the rich." And it's this very tearful, emotional goodbye scene. And after her departure, the meadow just feels like a lifeless desert. Some years later, Pinine is summoned by the king to fight in the Third Carlist War against the insurrectionists. As he's leaving by the train, he sticks his head out the window and says to Rosa, "Goodbye, Lamb," like they were saying to Lamb when she left before. As Pinine, like Lamb before him, is just beef for the rich. And the meadow, again, feels like a desert. And Rosa just gazes at the tracks and the telegraph cable and pole, and it says, quote, "With what hatred did Rosa gaze at the tracks, stained with burnt coal? With what rage did she appraise the telegraph wires? Oh, Lamb had chosen well never to go near them. That was the world, the unknown, which swallowed everything." And without realizing what she was doing, Rosa leaned her head against the pole that stood like a banner at the extremity of the Sumante. The wind sang its metallic song in the entrails of the dry pine. Now Rosa understood. It was a tearful refrain of abandonment, of solitude, of death. So yeah, short but powerful on this one. I really like this one. It's sad. Stories about animals like this always really get me. Balzac's Passion of the Desert's the same way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has some really good and not exactly subtle themes of how industrialization can destroy what is previously had been an idyllic country life.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, that kind of story is definitely something that can be quite powerful, but it's always felt a little bit alien to me, being always bred in an urban environment and so forth, and used to that, and kind of not like, oh, I mean, it's sad, but I guess I enjoyed hearing you talk about it, because although I felt like, yeah, it was a sad, kind of poignant little story, I didn't really feel like I connected with it. I didn't really feel it that much, which is kind of interesting, I guess.
Yeah.
Because it says more about me than the story.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I grew up in a rural area, and I also spent some time in high school in rural Spain, so I could imagine the kind of area where this would have taken place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This affected me a lot, and I thought about this for quite some time after I read it. And it's certainly way better than Future Story.
Yeah, Future Story was definitely strange and like had a lot of weird stuff going on, but that wasn't as cool as it could have been. But mind you, the translation could have also had something to do with that.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Whoever translated this, I think, did a really good job in that there weren't any sentences where it was like, oh, well, that's awkwardly phrased.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
it's short, so it doesn't really take, I guess, a great deal to get through the plot and kind of get through what is trying to be said by the author here.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't long, so I certainly I have no regrets about reading it, and I did see like the charming sort of childhood aspect of it, as that
Yeah,
you love the creatures that you live with, including your brother and the cow. Like,
right,
why wouldn't
right.
you, right? And it's just so sweet, the relationship they have together, and then suddenly that has to be taken away by the modern world, and it's
Right.
I don't know, it is sad and poignant.
Yeah.
Again, there's not really a lot that can be, I guess, expressed in thoughts about it. It's more just the way it feels, It's like
Yeah,
it
for
just
sure.
feels kind of like sad, and you're just that was a sad, poignant, innocence lost kind of story.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
she thought, oh, it's the wide world. The Telegraph is great, right? And
New and
then
exciting.
all of a sudden, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
the wide world just wants to take my beloved things away and my
Right.
people away, and
Yeah. For no reason, seemingly.
well, for no reason. I mean, were it not for industrialization, though, people would still go off to war in the armies, and it would
Right.
still
Yeah. Yeah.
be
That's true.
brutal. And
Yeah.
granted, though, the new weaponry and the new ways of transportation, I guess, made it easier for even more people to die,
Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah.
And that especially became a thing during the First World War,
Oh, yeah.
notoriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I get that. I mean, this predates that by several decades, but
Not too long, though.
yeah, and it was just on the horizon.
Yeah.
And, the machine gun was already invented, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Yep. But yeah, no, I'm glad we can sneak this one in. And I would like to read more of Clarin's stuff. It's just, I haven't really been able to find like a good Penguin edition or anything like that of his short stories.
No.
So I'm not really sure how much of it has been translated in English. But I certainly enjoyed this one, and I would definitely recommend it, especially for those kind of themes of focusing on industrialization and its potential effects on society. All right, so I think we're going to take a quick break now, and we're going to come back with a few stories where the wired telegraph becomes wireless.